Okay, and I'm going to record this for those that, okay, somebody hit record. For those who can't be here today to watch later. So thank you everybody for joining. This is a special occasion in that this is the first time that we here at Bixel are opening up our Lunch and Learn program to our colleagues over at DSC, and also I'm really hoping that our colleagues over at the Hutch program might have received this, and if they haven't, I hope they can watch it later. But also super excited to have the opportunity to have Dave Witkin present. I reached out to colleague Jason Catman over at USDS, who's very much focused on agile procurement practices over there, and he referred me over to Dave Witkin as an expert in this area. And so I have since gotten to know him and really appreciate him, to say the least. He runs his own business, and you'll hear a little bit more about him, but he's really somebody that if you are either a business owner or you're looking at pursuing an opportunity in the federal space, and perhaps your government client is thinking about reprocuring work, and you believe that it could be better done, the procurement process in particular could be better done using an agile approach, you may want to reach out to Dave and involve him in those early stages and perhaps even thereafter. So I'm very grateful for Dave taking the time to both prepare for this and share his knowledge. And I will pass it off to him to tell you more about him and share, bring us all up to speed on Agile Acquisitions.
Great, thanks for the very kind introduction, Carla. She's being very nice with the group. She told me earlier, since this is the first time they've had somebody external from Bixel at one of these things, she's kind of like, don't mess this up or else we won't be able to do it again. So I'm gonna try to keep that in mind as I go. But anyway, you know, one of the things I love about working with small businesses like Bixel is we focus on delivery. I think that's true of everybody in the Digital Services Coalition. We're relatively small businesses compared to some of the bigs, and we really do focus on delivery, and that's part of why we wanted to introduce the concept of Agile Acquisitions, because, and we'll give you a slide on this in a minute, our belief is it really can help small businesses like yours, like ours, win more business with the government because it levels the playing field with some of the bigs. And we'll talk about how we do that. As we jump in, I'll say, if you're joining now and you haven't already, do me a favor, we've got a real quick poll, a few questions. Go to survey.packageagile.com. There's 4 or 5 questions. You can just answer the first 3 though, if you'd like. It'll take you about 1 minute, and then we're gonna talk about some of the results and how they apply to what we're presenting here as we move through. So survey.packageagile.com should bring it up for you. All right, let's jump in. We still got some folks joining, but we can get started. As Carl said, just a real quick blurb about me. So I'm really focused on trying to increase the value of government spending and complex initiatives. And I do that through Lean, through Agile, and a lot of coaching clients in the government today. So I've been doing training, consulting, coaching in the government for the better part of 25 years. I was certified. Here's me and Dr. Jeff Sutherland. I don't know if you know, some of you may have heard his name. Jeff is one of the signers of the Agile Manifesto and a co-creator of Scrum, which is the most popular Agile methodology in the world. So here's me and Jeff kind of settling a debate as a joke. He's actually got a great sense of humor. So for me, it's a highlight of my career. I try to instill those tools, those practices and everything we do, like Agile Acquisitions. All right, and I've been maybe at 10 agencies, I think. I'm gonna go through all those. Anyway, as we start, let me talk through a couple shared definitions, because we get into this over and over and we realize people have different meanings for similar terms. And one of the keys is just, what do we mean by an acquisition? Well, for an acquisition, let me make sure I can, I'm sharing my cursor here. For an acquisition, we're really talking about an end-to-end process that is more than just what we'd say procurement staff are involved in. So we have mission staff who identify what's a need, something we need to satisfy. Maybe it's a congressional mandate, maybe it's recompeting contracts that they've had in the past, maybe it's something just brand new. It's the process of figuring out what those requirements are, then getting engaged with the procurement folks, doing market research, cost estimates, putting out those RFIs, RFPs, RFQs, us as contractors, as vendors, submitting proposals, going through evaluation, the vendors being selected by the government, of course, and then there's debriefs, awards, hopefully no process, and finally, we can start doing our work. So when we talk about acquisitions, we're talking about that whole end-to-end process. And for digital services, we've got a very, very simple definition. It may not be exactly the same as yours, but it's just any service that involves software data and the people who support it. So it could be coding, configuration, setup, hosting a new system on Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud, interfaces, building interfaces, testing, cybersecurity, and all the project and program management and other support roles that help do any of those things. So that's at least for this presentation, what we're going to use as definitions. And with that, I know a number of people are still joining. I'm going to give you just a few more seconds to fill out this survey, this poll rather. We're going to look at the results and we'll talk about how it works. Here's hopefully this works, a little bit of music, background music, to spur you on as you finish, as you go to survey.packageagile.com. Here we go. I'll just give you about 30 seconds. And not sure that's going to work. There we go. If all's going well, you're hearing a little music now. Okay, let's take a quick look at the results. Hopefully some of you had some time to do this. Let me refresh. It updates the responses as we go, so it's not too late if you haven't done it yet. So one of the first things we ask is, I'll read these, I know they may be a little tough to read. Does the government ask you for waterfall deliverables or other information like recurring status reports that gets in the way of us delivering the value they really want? And interesting here, so we got about 13 people, 3 people say it's sort of the sometimes, the 4s are very frequently, and the 5s are all the times. So almost nobody says that doesn't happen. And we'll talk about why that occurs. And again, I think Agile Acquisitions, part of what we're hoping it will do is help the government do a better job of not doing that so we can focus on the value they really want. And then, are we losing large contracts to large businesses because they've got these massive business development budgets, they've got resources we can't match? I love to say they can build the pretty proposal graphics like nobody's business. Maybe they're not great at delivery, but they know how to win work. And it sounds like a few of you might say, not so much, but the vast majority of you, again, that happens at least sometimes or pretty frequently where some of the bigs get in the way. And then we just wanted to know how many people, so we frame this a little bit, how many people have actually participated in something they thought was called an innovative or agile acquisition, and it looks like almost half of you have, and maybe some of the not sure's fall in there also. So that's actually a pretty good number. So we'll talk about why those are important. Some of you, we're going to talk about all the things that you, for those of you who answered this part as we go through. But thank you for doing that. That'll help us frame some of what we talk about. Let's, and And Carla and DJ, just want to let you know, I am not a huge GoToMeeting person. So if there are comments in the chat, if you want to let me know to take a checkpoint and stop. I'll see if I can figure out how to bring up that chat. There we go. I don't think I see anything. But if there is something, please feel free to stop me and we can hit those questions. So if you do have questions, please, I do encourage you to throw those in the chat as we go. All right. Well, let's start with a quick definition. What do we mean by agile acquisitions? And this means there is no one standard definition, unfortunately. We're going to give you ours that I think is, I don't want to say pretty standard, but really hits a lot of the highlights. Just understand others may have slightly different tweaks. A big one for us is what we're talking about is applying lean and agile techniques and concepts to the acquisition process. We're going to focus on things we'll see that are actually legal and encouraged, and our focus is avoiding the waste inherent in that normal acquisition process that we showed you earlier. Okay, so we're still moving at a pace. A lot of people would say it's like a 20th century pace. We need to up it a little bit, move faster, and get better quality. Okay. That's really what we're talking about. I will tell you, some people say agile acquisitions is just doing an acquisition that's going to end up in people doing agile work. I think that's a piece of it. But for us, it's really not an agile acquisition if you're not applying concepts to improve the acquisition process itself. And that's a lot of what we focus on. I know there may be other components to this topic within Bixel and other places where they bring in a few other experts to talk about this. And I think that's where they focus as well, on improving that process as well as the outcomes. All right. So why should you care? We already touched a little bit about this, but in short, our belief is because it really highlights the strengths of small businesses. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because we believe all of you, if you're involved in acquisitions at all, getting ahead of solicitations hitting the streets, guiding your clients to use these can be to your advantage. And part of it is because the large businesses, as we saw in the results from the survey, they often have proposal resources, business development resources that we don't. If we can focus the government and refocus them on a more high quality selection process, refocus them on principles, one of which we'll call show me, rather than just give us pieces of paper that are very pretty, actually do something for me and show me that you can deliver. And then finally, we saw in the results to that poll, lots of agile or contracts from the government still ask us, even if they want an agile approach, they're still asking us for deliverables to do things that are inconsistent with good agility. So through an agile acquisition, we believe it's very helpful, especially to small businesses, to address these kinds of issues. And we'll show you how as we move through. To take us through this topic, we are going to follow Tasha. Tasha is a U.S. government program manager, and she's just got an assignment from her leadership. She needs to buy and implement this new digital services solution that's going to be, let's call it roughly $25 to $30 million over 3 years is their rough estimate. She's under a lot of pressure to do it fast and to get it right. Unfortunately, lots of other acquisitions at her agency often take 12 to 20 months, and she can't take that long. If she does, they're not going to get it done in time. Let's say there's some congressional mandates, they'll be in big trouble. So what is she to do? Well, first, she thinks about what's really important when she buys anything, right? And if you're a really good government program manager, you understand you need to get the right answer. You need the value that is expected. And oftentimes you need to get it fast. We could say in the past, government moved slow, that was perfectly fine. That's not so much the case anymore. People are making promises. The market is moving faster, the private sector, and people expect the same of government. So they get bonus points if they can get it cheap and easy. The challenge is a lot of our procurements today seem to focus down here. They focus on who's going to be the cheapest price, relatively inexpensive compared to other companies, and how can we do it with what we already know, right? The buying process that we have already, that we believe is largely compliant with laws and regulations. Too much focus down here, not enough up here. So we'll look at what are the results of that. And today, GSA and 18F would say of software projects over 6 million, which is a large number of what we do. That's not 6 million a year, that's 6 million in total, maybe over a couple of years. Only about 13% succeed. It's a really, really low number. I don't know, I'm interested if that's the case, what you see in your agencies. Hopefully Bixel, other parts of the DSC are doing better than this, but traditionally these are some of the metrics that GSA and 18F have put out there. And Air Force, which has much bigger programs, this one at the bottom, we'll see some confirmation from a third party for some of this. 40% of them never deliver anything. That means we've spent millions, tens of millions, and at the end of it, nothing goes into production. Simply, a lot of times, just because they took so long, priorities changed. So this is where I'd say speed really matters a lot, and more agile acquisitions should be a lot faster. Okay, so we didn't put this in the survey, but I'm interested. If you don't mind going into the chat right now, hopefully you got it up, and in just a couple words or less, and I'm going to scan these, a couple words or less, tell me, why do you think, from your own knowledge, why do you think there's so many challenges with government acquisitions? And if you need to, if you got so many views on this, you're going to write a book, then tell me just what do you think the top challenge is? Okay, can you bring up the chat? Throw it right in there. I'd like to see what thoughts you have. I can read that. It's a little bit small. Anybody mind throwing their thoughts into the chat there? Thank you. A few are coming in. Changing priorities. Okay. Overextended federal staff. That's a great one. Regulations. Thank you, Michael. And I'm squinting here because this is really small type on my monitor. Regulations are huge concerns, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. The set budgets, right? We've got an annual budget cycle, is great. They love doing things the same way. I think that's excellent, even if it's not working real well, right? Not being very familiar with Agile, yeah, some of the education, great. And fear of engaging with industry, oof, huge. And we're definitely going to talk about that as part of the process. So thank you. I know these are still coming in. I may refer back to these, so please continue to put your thoughts in. These are all great though, and they are things that we hear over and over. So let's talk about that. Let me start probably with the number one thing we hear. Number one is laws and regulations make doing a better job with acquisitions, forget agile acquisitions, just doing better acquisitions impossible. And so I'm glad, let's see, who was it? Michael in the chat is the first one that I see who brought this up. This is the number one. And when you talk to contracting officers, this is what we hear quite a bit. The challenge here is, it turns out it's not really true. So we've got people, one of my mentors was Jonathan Mostowski, who I think Clara and Bixel may have come in and talk a little bit later. There are plenty of contracting officers, and we've got tons of examples now where they use the same regulations as everybody else, and they're able to move 50, sometimes even 75% faster, right? And we'll show you how they do that. So a lot of this is, and somebody else put it in the chat, it's a misbelief. There's education and misbelief that acquisitions has to be done in exactly the same way that we've seen it done over and over again, and it has to take in a massive amount of time. Not the case. I'm going to tell you, I am not a FAR expert. So I rely on contracting officers, and we get consultants in to talk about which parts of the FAR we can use or things outside the FAR to be able to do agile acquisition techniques, innovative techniques. So I don't I'm not sure if anybody out there is an acquisition expert. I'm just warning you, if you were to ask me for the finer details of FAR Part 8.4, I'm not the guy to tell you. What I can tell you is all these things, this has been done many, many times now, and the regulations, while they are not ideal, are far from the biggest issue. So what's the real problem here, right? What do we really need to address with Agile Acquisitions? And this is the results of a survey from 155 government staff acquisition professionals who are interested in innovation, who had dealt with this for a long time, many of them very frustrated that we haven't made more progress here. And the number one problem had nothing to do with laws and regulations. It was simply collaboration, that we did not do a very good job. Somebody brought this up in the chat, of not only dealing internally with our IT folks, our procurement folks, the program or the mission staff, but the vendors as well. A lot of times the vendors like us, we could advise these folks to do things a little bit better, but they didn't ask or they simply didn't listen. Education was another one that came up. People don't understand agility in general, and they certainly don't understand what's allowable for innovative acquisitions. And then finally, misaligned incentives, which means, what do they mean by that? It's that the contracting professionals are pushed to use these old school methods. Program offices want mission results, right? So they're focused on something different. IT may be focused on making sure we have the right target architecture, making sure the application is secure, meeting cybersecurity requirements, and so on. So people internally to the agencies, forgetting about the vendors, have different incentives. And what we end up with is oftentimes a cut and paste acquisition that is just all over the place and isn't internally consistent because of all this misalignment. So I bring this up because agility, some of you who are really steeped in agility may already know, agility is the principles we use are really, really good actually at addressing all of these things, especially collaboration and the misaligned incentives. We do coaching as a way for education, but we're very good at this. So how do we apply it? Let me get into some examples, because I definitely don't want to leave you with just high level views. A traditional acquisition, it may be, this is a representative time frame, 14 months, where for a $25 or $30 million acquisition, like we talked about for Tasha, they may spend 7 months in requirements, right? Trying to figure out what it is that they actually want. And a lot of times they're getting very detailed 100-page requirement documents. They need to go through request and approval. Then they do proposals. So they put an RFP or RFQ out, we respond, maybe there's a draft RFP, we respond to that, they change it a little bit, there's Q&A. It's frequent that can take a couple months with the Q&A and all the edits. And then they often take 2 to 3 months for evaluation. Finally, they select, and hopefully there's no protest. Again, 14 months, some people would say, if you look internally, right, because we often don't look at this as contractors, this piece here or either of these pieces here, but including that, 14 months is, some people feel very short. The guidelines we've gotten from former contracting officers is this is a pretty good sense. It can go anywhere from 9 to 36 months to do something like this. With an Agile acquisition, what's different, right? Well, first, one of the things we know we don't do in agility is big 100-page requirements documents. So we can usually shave a bunch of time off the process just by focusing on a vision, super high-level requirements, and then the outcomes that we want. What are the metrics that we really want to focus on? So we refocus the government on those. We still have to get some approvals, and then rather than sort of a back and forth with proposals, where we create these big paper proposals, we send them over to the government, they look at them, and at the end we get an answer. We do much more co-creation. We do much more work together. And we're going to show you an example of that on the next slide. In short, though, on average, and there's no perfect metrics for this, but we can typically do things about 50% faster. And we think we get higher quality as well. So what are we doing in here? Let me break down the example a little bit more. First, I'll tell you that whether it's us, and this is one of the things that as we talked to Carl about, we are hoping, right, that we're providing a service that can benefit companies like Bixel, others in the Digital Services Coalition, that if it makes sense, you call us in to help your clients. We're not going to compete with you. We're more on the front of the acquisition. That we talk to them about ways to do this that we believe will benefit many of you. They're not going to do it on their own, right? They need help for a lot of reasons we're going to talk about. But we do exactly what we talked about. We do what we do in good agility. We create a vision for the procurement, outcome-oriented requirements. We do a streamlined cost estimate, knowing that we can fix costs and move scope around a little bit. We'll look at specifics to the agency. So the agency, for example, some agencies have other transaction authority. They don't even need to use the FAR to go get stuff. We'll look at what do we need to tailor, and that might be based on the size of the acquisition and what the agency is allowed to do. Different agencies have different rules for what they're allowed to do. Oftentimes, one of the biggest wastes is the government gets proposals from 20 or 30 vendors who are simply not qualified. And the problem is then they look for ways to disqualify people, and sometimes they're going to disqualify Bixel. Sometimes they're going to disqualify others in the DSC. Why? Because your margins were not 1 inch on the sides. You happen to use 10.5 font somewhere in a proposal graphic when their requirements were 12 point. These are ways they look for, how do we throw companies out? Because we got too many proposals to review. And unfortunately, there is no correlation, as far as I'm aware, between people who are perfect with using 12-point font in their proposals and 1 inch margins to people who can actually deliver, right? So they are, what I mean is, jokes aside, they're throwing out perfectly capable vendors in some cases because of something that has no business being evaluated in the first place. So anyway, so what we want to do is get them to a place where we figure out who's really capable of delivering, right? And I think small firms often are, and getting those people on a qualified bidder list and not having the government waste time with 20 or 30 other vendors who have never done something similar before and often don't deliver in the first place on whatever other things they've done. So key piece of this. Another key piece is, again, part of show me, don't tell me, is rather than focus on big paper proposals, we can still have small paper proposals. We're going to call people like Bixel in, and we are going to have conversations with them, right? Some people say, well, you're not allowed to do that as part of the proposal process. And we would say, yeah, we really are. Not only are we allowed to do it, people like Tracy Walker would say, who's formerly US Digital Services, we are encouraged to do it. Again, people don't understand what the regulations allow today. So we're going to have folks like Bixel in. We're going to have some interactive conversations. We may have them demo a product if that's part of the solution. And then even if we don't have a product, we, the government, might give a company a contest, a problem to solve in front of us. And we ask you to spend 2 or 4 or even 6 hours solving something. We'll interact with you during the process. We, the government, will interact with you. And at the end, we, the government, will evaluate what we just saw in front of us. Your team actually working together. And we're going to look at both the product, assuming that you created a product. In some cases you will, and some you won't. And but more importantly, I'd say a lot of times, the team process. How did your team work together? Did they seem to know what they were actually doing? How did they problem solve? We watched them doing some testing. Did it seem like they had a good thought process as they were going through testing? Right? Maybe we have them do some user-centered design. Did they seem to know techniques off the top of their head for doing that effectively, right? Or are they just, rather than somebody who might put down all these techniques on a piece of paper, but their team's never done it before? So that's what the government would evaluate. And at the end, again, this is an example, but at the end, they might award to 2 vendors. And task 1 on your award is take the next 2 weeks and build a rapid prototype and a demo for us, the government, okay? And then based on that, based on looking at that rapid prototype, now they select a winner. And we do some of the things that we typically do during the proposal process. We'll say, vendor, let's develop some metrics, maybe develop them together. And you're gonna go develop a performance work statement. And we will sign for some additional tasking. And now the government is gonna continue work with hopefully somebody like us, these small businesses that actually can deliver on their promises. This is one example, lots of variations, but this is what it may look like. And the reason I say there's lots of variations is because, again, every agency is a little different. This reduces risk to a degree. If you needed more risk reduction, we might do some of these steps even longer. So rather than a 1 day per vendor contest, we may bring them in for 2 or 3 days. And if it's $100 million proposal, right, or 200 million, for example, that would reduce risk more than if it was something that was 15, 20, even $30 million. Okay. And please do type in the chat if there is anything. I have a hard time reading this, Carla. Is there anything in there that that we need to respond to?
Nothing right now. Some really good comments, but no questions right now. And I will jump in whenever you have a pause. Okay, Stephanie is asking, how is cost factored into the process?
Yeah, and I'd ask Stephanie, do you mean in terms of how much upfront work we're doing here, or how is it factored into the government estimating the total value of the contract? And I don't know if you can take yourself off mute and just.
Yeah, I think both, right? I would say sort of the cost that a company has to invest in the process, and then the cost of the total value of the contract. How do they assess that?
Yep. So let's talk about the first thing you said first, because to me, that's the biggest difference. So in essence, and we'll do this during the market research phase with the government, we'll talk to businesses, we'll talk to Bixel, other businesses and say, look, we're thinking about doing this process this way. But to do it this way, your paper proposal is only going to be about 5 pages, really, really brief. So we don't need you to invest a lot there. But we are going to have a 1 day capability demo, and we would expect you to bring a team of, let's say, 7 to 9 people in to do that demo. And our hope would be those are people who the vast majority who you're actually going to have on the engagement, right? And then you, Bixel, would say, okay, whether or not we think that is a cost given the size of the possible award that you're willing to bear. My belief is most times because I think it gives small companies an advantage in other ways, first, the cost may be less than responding to a 50-page proposal. But even if not, I'd say it is a business decision on Bixel's part to say, look, if you were to do that, then is this something we think we would support, yes or no? And I think you would tell the government that based on, I think, the size of the award. So you might say, bringing in that team will cost us about $25,000 in total for that day, for example. And then you got to figure out whether you think it's worth it for you. Does that answer that first part, Stephanie?
Yeah, no, it does.
And for the second part, which I'd say is the IGCE, it really isn't all that different from what they do today. The independent government cost estimate for the government figuring out what's the total cost of the acquisition, they're still just gonna, frankly, the way we estimate, there's a little bit of magic in there, right? We're gonna say, look, based on what we've done in the past, hopefully some vendors give us some ideas through market research, how much it might cost. We're just gonna set a cost that'll go into our acquisition strategy or plan. Let's say it's 25 million over 3 years. And then like we do in Agile, the reality is we will trade off scope for quality and time if we need to. We will say, look, government, we're going to guarantee you we'll deliver stuff every sprint or every 90 days, whatever it is, but we're going to need your help for trade-offs with scope, because we can't trade off all three. We don't want to trade off quality. And if you're saying time is the most important, then we're going to need, the only thing we can do is a trade-off scope. All right, any others? And Stephanie, if that didn't hit it all, do me a favor, just throw it in the chat and I'll see if I can add more to that. So we said there are a lot of variations, right? We can't tell you there's a one size fits all. So what we've done, just like in Agile, Scrum, SAFe, lots of other Agile methods, we've come up with a number of principles that we fall back to figure out how do we help the government build these in a way that supports small businesses, that supports faster acquisitions. And one we've already seen. This is the, don't tell me on paper you can do it, it's show me, or working products beat paper in the acquisition process. People think you need a 100-page response, you don't. And certainly we don't need a 100-page response from 20 or 30 vendors. Getting a 5-page response or 2-page response from 50 vendors and narrowing them down based on that 2-page response allows the government to focus a lot more on vendors who are capable of doing the work. Another big one, and this is part of the planning, that I would hope, again, if you are helping shape procurements with your clients, you talk to them to do agility well. We really need, we need government to jump in and be part of those teams. So some of this is helping the government plan so they can support you effectively as well. We won't go through all of these, but like a lot of the principles in the Agile Manifesto and Scrum and SAFe, they're there for a reason. They came from studies. They came from a lot of failures. And I'm going to show you how a few of these principles that we just showed do come from what we found works well in the industry. This is one. So here's our friend Tasha again, that government program manager. She's seen lots of cases where vendors who perform after award, some people contribute, some people don't. And there are some studies confirming what she's seen. In this case, in some cases, the difference between the top 10% of programmers and the bottom 10% could be as much as 10 to 1 or 1,000%. And this just isn't the case for people writing code. Before you say, well, that's only developers, we've got lots of other types of team members. Here's Steve Jobs talking about for more creative pursuits, that in his view, getting really, really strong people, not saying every 7-year coder is exactly equal, that they're all a commodity, but getting great players could be a difference of 50 or 100 to 1. The reason we bring this up is because of situations like these. These are a little bit cherry-picked examples, of course, but adding a lot more people to programs doesn't necessarily make them better. What we'd really like, and what some of these principles rather are organized around, is if we have the option to keep things less complicated, to do smaller teams, but even if we pay a lot more money for those teams, if they're actually producing stuff, we'd rather do that. We'd rather have the government do that, because we end up getting a lot more the government end up getting a lot more value for our money. A few others. We know, here's a study from the Standish Group that basically shows some of why those huge failures in that the prior slide happened. They're too complicated, they're too big. So what this is basically showing is that the failure rate where you deliver nothing for smaller programs, and I think your smaller is under $1 million, is about 1/10 the failure rate of larger projects. And you might say, well, we're talking about a $25 to $30 million acquisition here. This doesn't really apply to what we're saying. But that's part of what we try to do in agility and agile acquisitions. We help the government beforehand do a better job of breaking down the work into chunks. And that might be, some of you may call them epics or big features. And we work on those in a way, we get them delivered in a way that makes a large project act a lot more like a small project. It's not perfect. I'm going to tell you, I think the actual failure rate, even if we had small projects, is going to be somewhere in the middle here. But the more that we can help the government start working in a more agile way, breaking down chunks, the closer we can help them get to these smaller failure rates. All right, just a few more minutes and then we'll get into a little bit more Q&A, done with the proposal piece. People ask, how do we evaluate the proposals? We've already given some insight into this. A traditional procurement focus, they focus on pieces of paper and maybe orals. And by orals, I mean, they ask us to stand up and talk for 90 minutes straight, and supposedly they're listening. There's not a whole lot of interaction. In Agile Acquisitions, we focus a lot more on interactive discussions with the government, which again are perfectly supported by the regulations. Some would say they're even encouraged. We talked about some of this before. They may give us a problem to solve, they, the government, and they watch us solve them. And sometimes, doesn't always work, it depends on the size of the acquisition, what we're building, but often it makes sense that we actually collaborate on a working proposal together with the government. And if we do a great job, they award us more work. So that's really where we want them evaluating us, and hopefully that means we as small businesses will have a better shot of winning. Skip over this. I will tell you, one of the things that when we talked about doing this, one of the fun things we often see is a lot of people call things agile acquisitions, rapid acquisitions, innovative acquisitions, and we saw a little bit of this in response to the poll at the beginning. I'm going to show you some signs of supposedly agile acquisitions that are not really agile acquisitions. And the number one piece I'd say is what I call the pixel dust approach. And what that means is the acquisition folks, the mission area folks, whoever's building the acquisition, they take the old acquisition material that maybe they used 5 or 10 years ago, and statements of work, statements of objectives, and they liberally just sprinkle the words Agile, Scrum, Safe, and DevOps throughout the text. It's simple, right? What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, when they do this, the results are often a mess, because Agile is not just a term, we work differently, right? They'll end up with saying things like, you're gonna have a different team for this, a different team for that, and that's not how we work in agility. So we end up where cases where the contract says we have to do something, even though we know it's not the right answer. So clearly that pixel dust approach, or Pixie dust approach, is something that we want to avoid. So with some other former contracting officers, we put together 7 signs of the Pixie dust approach. And I'm going to warn you up front, many of you have probably seen some of these, maybe you've participated in these. I have seen all of them and participated in all of them, so please don't feel bad if these are some of the acquisitions that you've worked on with the government and they call them agile or rapid or innovative. This is part of the warning signs that we look for. Number 1, 50 or more mandated requirements. Again, in a true agile acquisition, we're going to focus on a vision and outcome oriented. Number 2, separate testing team or separate development team or separate requirements team. This isn't how we work. Right? Change requests needed to modify scope. We really want to have what's here, government staff embedded and contributing daily, often as a product owner who has the authority to reprioritize and modify scope as needed. It's a key element of success. We talked about market research. Oftentimes, I don't know that the government's really doing any. right? Or it's very minor. The far parts on market research, it's just 1 or 2 pages, and it basically encourages them to do whatever they think they need to do to learn more about the market and the vendors. So we really want them to call Bixel, to call other members of the DXC and have those conversations. And that's part of what we spur on when we help them with these Agile acquisitions. Frequent status reports required. Probably, I think that's one of those things that more than not detracts from our ability to deliver. And finally, if they are asking you for a big 50-page paper response, even a 20-page paper response, and you're not going through a live Q&A, that sort of thing, that is probably our #1 sign that they think they're doing something that's an Agile acquisition, but they probably aren't. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here. When it's done properly, there's lots of positive results we've seen. I will tell you, none of this is statistically significant, right? A lot of this is anecdotal or a small number of positive experiences. But I will tell you, this is where if Bixel does continue this conversation with some other people like Jonathan Mostowski or Tracy Walker from the DSC, my guess is they can give you a lot of additional anecdotal reasons and history for why they think this works well. And that's basically all I got. So I thought I'd Carla, I think we've got some time left. How are we doing? We got about 10 minutes. I don't know if anybody will have questions or other things we haven't hit, but wanted to make sure we left some time for that.
Excellent. I hope people have questions and that they want to take advantage of these remaining 10 minutes that we've got. And on the note of next steps and referencing Tracy and Jonathan, we hope to get a second session planned with them in early December. And I've already been in touch with Jason Catman, who specializes in Agile acquisitions over at USDS, and he might be able to join that too. So we're excited about a second session. But what's really great about this is that you really brought folks up to speed on the basics, the foundational understanding of Agile 101. So thank you so much. And it looks like Megan on our team has a question. Her question is, with a high cost, often longer internal length bureaucracy of the procurement process, it seems to create disincentives for shorter, leaner procurements. Do you have examples of how clients have worked around that, or any data examples to offer our clients? Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to give you my view. This is one I'd really be interested in Jonathan and Tracy's and the next thing. I think this is a great question for that, Carla. My view is because of how, let me say this. So especially as a smaller company, but for any company, really, the way the government wants us to go through this process, it's a complete disincentive. Right? So to do something short, even we're talking about a 7-month process, if you use a good Agile acquisition process, or 6 months, that's still a really long process. Maybe you're not involved in the whole thing, but a fairly long process to go through where you might only get 3 months of work out of it. So when we encourage the government, we'd say, look, you can use this process, but if you would have done a 5-year, a 1-year base and 4-year options as a result of this, I'd suggest you still do that, because we want to incentivize small businesses, large business, whoever we think the right vendors are, to bid. And if we try to shorten it too much and there's not enough money, then we small businesses, even the big businesses, they're not going to bid on it. And then that hurts the government. So I still think, yes, you're right. The process, even a faster process that we're talking about, is a disincentive to shorter contract lengths. And we often guide, especially of things of this size, which is where we focus, we'll guide the government against it and say, don't think you can, because you're moving faster, now you can cut this down and do a 1-year award and believe you're still going to get the same quality of competition. You won't, because people don't want to go through and spend 50, 100, sometimes it used to be with Accenture. We talk about our BD budget for certain proposals literally in the millions of dollars. We're not going to do that if it's a 1-year job for, you know, $500,000 and very few guarantees. You know, they're going to recompete it in that long. So that's my somewhat long-winded answer. We still guide them for these larger procurements. I don't think it's still not good enough to address it where you can get a really short, you know, 2, 3, even 6-month period of performance where it's going to make sense a lot of times.
Dave, I just wanted to share one comment on, this is more of a comment than it is necessarily a question, but the focus on outcomes. When the government asks vendors to help them brainstorm around outcomes, I fundamentally believe that that's really where you're getting the expertise of your private sector vendors to share ideas, potential ideas to reach those outcomes. And I really don't understand why federal agencies wouldn't take advantage of that if they are able.
Absolutely. I've got a good friend. He's also a friend with a mutual friend of ours, Carla, Jason Catman. And I won't mention him by name, but he says, you know, there's still a couple camps within the government. And one is that the vendors are the enemy and that they are going to try to fleece the government for everything they can. And we know we, the government, know what we want. So why ask them? It's a waste of time. They are going to give us information that just, you know, supports them. And it's unfortunate. You know, I've been in this business a long time. I think we were talking about some of the longevity earlier. You have as well. I firmly believe there may be a few folks and a few companies I've seen that really, I feel, are primarily focused on just getting every dollar they can out of the government. But a lot of us really care about delivering value. And I think, again, this is where I think a few bad apples makes it really, really difficult because of that view. But I think that is changing. The more that we work in an agile way with people too, the more we have these government product owners who actually embed themselves with our team. They help us with our challenges. I think they're going to start to trust us more because they're going to see most of the people on the ground, especially, we don't want to fraud the government. We just want to deliver great products. That's what gets a lot of us up in the morning, right? So my belief is the more agile we can make them in delivery and working with us, the more hopefully they're going to push to actually listen to us during phases like market research.
So this is, Stephanie has a rather meaty question, and Stephanie and a few others on the line work with our USAID clients, and it's a little different over there. And she's asking, because they have this like co-creation process, but Stephanie asks, how is intellectual property protected in this process? Because our client at USAID often does these co-creation events where people get together to share their knowledge in the same space. And some come out winners, some losers, and they're all a bit concerned about sharing their intellectual property, especially amongst themselves. So
I see. Yeah, in this particular case, we actually protect it pretty well. So I've gone back to another slide just to show, again, there are lots of variations on this, but in this base case, everything we're doing is still subject to, we own it, and confidentiality clauses. So none of what we're doing in this process is actually open to outside vendors, if that addresses it. But so that we can have, we can agree before we walk in the room that the government won't take some of what we did, especially if we have some intellectual property, and share it with a competitor. So this is not an everybody in the room process, at least again, the way it's envisioned here. We've had some of those as well, but this particular one, in terms of choosing the right vendor, is very, the vendor information is segmented. Okay.
excellent. Michael had a question about, and I think I addressed it. Dave, you're saying that this should be ideally, this is used on longer term procurements, 3 and 5 years, correct?
Yeah, at least for us to support them, to help the government with them, there's a cost involved. So for them to bear that cost, it gets, what's the word I'm looking for? There's economies of scale. If it's a really, really big procurement. So for us, we'll say if it's under $15 million, don't get me wrong, they may try to do it on their own, but a company like ours probably can't. It's just going to be too much money to support them unless they want us to come in and help with like 10 different really small procurements. We'll do that in kind of a dojo fashion where we'll support them that way. But yes, so don't misunderstand me. I think this can work. It absolutely can work on smaller procurements. The question for me is the government going to have somebody to guide them well enough where they can do this effectively? And that's where I'd say, I don't know if your folks know, there's actually a program that Jonathan and Tracy Walker helped and put into place called DITAP. It's the digital IT. It's not like, I don't remember what it stands for. It's basically a 6-month program for contracting officers to help them learn how to do better digital acquisitions. Now, I believe in theory in what they're doing, but we've talked to people who've come out of that program and still said they are not confident to do something like this, or they've said they can't convince their leadership. So if we look at outcomes, you can go through that 6-month process, and unfortunately, a lot of the people who do still don't feel that they're equipped to do this. So I worry for some of the smaller acquisitions, whether the internal people at the agency are equipped to do this on their own.
Okay, and what we'll do is we'll plan on hitting on that topic and asking Tracy and others for a bit more information on the DITAP program, and then what we can do as the vendor community to support our colleagues in the government space on adopting more of these practices. But so, Dave, running out of time here, but thank you so very much, and I really hope that you'll be on our next one. But thank you so much for your time and sharing your knowledge, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. Okay?
Thanks all.
Have a good rest of your Thursday.
All right. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.